Okay, so this is the last of the module on Big Five. It's neuroticism. So people high on neuroticism are prone to irrational ideas, are less able to control their impulses, and tend to cope poorly with stress. So as you can imagine, theoretically, you wouldn't want to have high neuroticism. And usually, when we do psychological testing, we check neuroticism to see how a person might have issues with anxiety or depression or other concerns. So let's look at the facets under neuroticism. So the first three are anxiety, angry hostility, and depression. So when we say anxiety, so you know that already, you have a general idea of what that is. But people high on anxiety are apprehensive, fearful, prone to worry, nervous, tense, and jittery, and more likely to have specific phobias. So these are people who often think of things in the future particularly, and have issues and concerns about things that might go wrong in across various events or circumstances in the future. Next is angry hostility. People high on angry hostility tend to experience anger, frustration, and bitterness more easily. I think that's self-explanatory. So if you have someone who perhaps has temper and who you find is often angry or irritable, then that's someone with high angry hostility facet. The next one is depression. People high on this are prone to feelings of guilt, sadness, hopelessness, and loneliness, and are easily discouraged and often dejected. So sometimes people assume that people high on anxiety are also high on depression. While there is a correlation, those two things are very different. Okay, so when you have a high score on the facet of depression, you generally experience loneliness and hopelessness and feelings of sadness or being down, quote unquote, more often than not when you experience stressors. The next set has to do with self-consciousness, impulsivity, and vulnerability. So the first is self-consciousness. People high on this trait are sensitive to ridicule and prone to feelings of inferiority, shyness, and social anxiety. So these are people who are very concerned. Someone with high self-consciousness is a person who's very concerned with how he or she is viewed by other people, and they tend to be very hyper aware of people's criticisms, and so they are prone to feelings of inferiority, and they often try to avoid situations where they might get embarrassed or they might be criticized or judged for their actions. The next one is impulsiveness. People high on this have a poor ability to control cravings and urges, and desires are perceived as being so strong that the individual finds it difficult to resist. So these are people who would have trouble resisting impulses, especially thoughts and feelings of things that they like to do, so they tend to just do it. And when they, for example, have certain emotional reactions to things, they would tend to just express them. So that's impulsiveness. And the last one is vulnerability. People who score high on this feel unable to cope with stress, become dependent, hopeless, or panic when facing emergency situations. So again, this is different from depression or anxiety or self-consciousness. This specifically has to do with depending on other people and not really knowing what to do in the face of a stressful task that for other people who have low vulnerability might be relatively manageable on their own. Okay, so again, this is a person who would panic or who would run for help from other people when faced with a stressful or difficult situation. Okay? So that's neuroticism. And again, a high neuroticism score on a Big Five personality test would be something that you'd not be surprised to find on someone with various anxiety disorders or various depressive or mood disorders, among other things. So how do we use that information on Big Five? We don't look at them while of course we can look at them individually. We also tend to look at how they play out together. So an example of that would be when we look at style of defense here. So this is an example of a report on the Neo-Pi-R. So the Neo-Pi-R is one of the most empirically supported personality tests available, and this is an example of a chart showing how whether the scores are bordering into like the upper portions would mean that you have very high scores of the different dimensions and the different facets, and of course the ones that fall lower means you have quite lower scores on the said dimensions. Like, pretty self-explanatory again. We'll delve deeper into what those scores mean when we go to psychological assessment. So that's like a year from now. Okay, so let's just look at one example of how the traits can be combined to sort of predict how a person would respond in a particular situation. So one example is style of defense. So when we talk about style of defense, we're referring to what are the likely coping behaviors or coping mechanisms of people when they are faced with something that's anxiety inducing or stress inducing. So here we typically view neuroticism and openness to experience scores. So let's say a person has a 54.7 score or a 54 score on neuroticism and a 56 score on openness. So depending on where the person falls within this radar chart, then that would indicate the typical style of defense of the person. So in this case, we see that the person has high neuroticism and high openness to experience. And the chart says that hypersensitive individuals seem undefended. They are alert to danger because, remember, of high neuroticism, which usually is associated with anxiety. So meaning they're very quick at thinking about potential dangers in the future, and then also vulnerability, among other things. Yeah, and they vividly imagine possible misfortune. So because they're also high in openness, that's also to be expected. They may be prone to nightmares because they think in unusual and creative ways. They may sometimes be troubled by odd and eccentric ideas. So combine anxiety with imagination, with fantasy. Remember the use of fantasy in openness to experience. So those might play out in the way you cope with particular situations. On the other hand, so this is parang sort of the ideal. Someone low on neuroticism and high on openness to experience would be termed adaptive. Okay, so adaptive individuals are keenly aware of conflict, stress, and threat, but use these situations to stimulate creative adaptations. They grapple intellectually with their own intrapsychic problems. So when they're experiencing anxiety or stress, when they have problems, they look inward and they try to explore intellectually their problems, and they may react to life stress as a source of humor or artistic inspiration. So again, because they have high openness to experience, so whether that's in terms of the artistic aesthetic appreciation, or in terms of, let's say, their ideas and values, among other things, or their feelings. So they're very attuned to those things, and so they respond very well. So you'd consider someone, probably like, from, for example, from a psychodynamic perspective, as someone who would use sublimation, for instance, diba? So yeah. On the other hand, so let's say, for example, you have low neuroticism and low openness to experience, diba? So hyposensitive individuals rarely experience strong negative affect, because when you're low on neuroticism, diba, your affectivity is low. You're not emotional. You're not easily triggered, for example. Okay. And when they do feel negative affect, they downplay its importance. They do not dwell on threats or losses, turning instead to concrete action to solve the problem, or simply to distract themselves. They put their faith in higher power. So, as you can imagine, this is someone with someone with low openness to experience, would just want the conventional things, want things to be very simple and routinary, so they don't want to have to think about things, speculate, for example. So they'd rather stick to what they know works and what is familiar to them, and so they go and act on whatever it is that may be bothering them to solve it as fast as possible, diba? Or if they can't solve it on their level, they would trust something like such as a higher power. On the other hand, so the last is, what if you have high neuroticism and low openness to experience? So we call that maladaptive style of defense. So maladaptive individuals tend to use primitive, ineffective defenses. So they use either repression or denial or reaction formation. They may prefer not to think about disturbing ideas, and they may refuse to acknowledge possible dangers, such as a serious illness, for example. They lack insight into the distressing affects they experience, and because they cannot verbalize their feelings, they may be considered alexithymic. So that means that when they have negative emotions, they find it very difficult to make sense of all these things. They can't express that, and they can't reflect on it very well, again, because of the low openness to experience. And they also find it very difficult to use more creative or more adaptive strategies to deal with those negative emotions and negative reactions. Okay? So yeah, so you can imagine what that would mean to a person if, like, let's say the person is applying for a job, or let's say you want to see how a person responds to stressful situation. This would be very helpful. Okay, so that's one example of how you apply Big Five. So if you have questions, you can always ask in our group chat, or you can send me a personal message. That's okay, but I'd rather that you address that in group chat, so your other classmates can also follow up with their own questions regarding the Big Five. So yeah, I hope you learned something. And if you want more information, you can always contact me. Okay?